We've just released our Global Status Report for 2014, and we've got some really good news this year. We've now got 22 projects around the world either operating or under construction. So that's up by somewhere about 2 over last year. We've got another 14 that in the next 12 to 18 months should reach final investment decision as well. So in prospect is a pretty good outcome for CCS. It's sort of worth reflecting that in 2010 we only had 2/3 that number, so we've got a 50% increase now over what we had at the turn of the decade. The other interesting thing here is we've got the first power plant in operation with full CCS in Boundary Dam in Canada, and hearing from Mike Monier of that initiative just yesterday. It's been running for a month and it's performing vastly better than they expected. Lower parasitic load, 90% capture and 99.99% purity, so they're delighted with the result. So that's a great breakthrough. So it's here and it's real on power. China is the other story. 3 years ago I don't think we were able to really pinpoint China anywhere on our league table. This year they've come in at number 2. So US is first, China second. It's really interesting to see how these things are changing all the time. I guess if we've got a concern, the outlook for limits on emissions and a global policy and attitude on that is rather lacking at the moment, and that's stalling the bringing forward of new investments. So we really do need to see that there's a clear decision about climate change mitigation into the future.
I mean, what sort of decision do you need to ensure that fossil fuel companies invest in CCS? Because it seems under any of the scenarios, if you're running a coal plant now, you need to be seriously considering CCS, and that doesn't seem, looking in from the outside, to be happening.
I think it's probably happening more than you might realise, and particularly where we've seen a reduction in the total number of projects. So it's down by about 20 odd projects over the past 3 years. Most of those are not cancelled. In fact, what they are is on hold is the status. So people have done a lot of work. They're waiting to see. Now, what I'd say to you is the science is clear, and I think the IPCC's fifth assessment synthesis report is important, and as you say, reinforces the importance of CCS. But that's got to turn into policy. That's got to turn into firm statements from nations. And I think when you see policy that is clear and targets that are clear, that are going to be enforced with proper policy support as well as potentially penalties in some cases, then quite frankly the capital follows those things. And I think that's the big missing link just at the moment.
Shell has been a very high profile backer of CCS. Anyone who particularly lives in London can't miss their big Red Bull adverts that seem to be on the tube and everywhere else. What do you think is motivating Shell, and why do you think some of the other leading fossil fuel producers are not being as proactive as they are?
Well, it's always dangerous for me to speculate on behalf of some of the members what might be motivating them. I think Shell's actions speak for itself, and each time I hear any representative from Shell speaking, they actually start with an acceptance of the climate science, and then they're obviously making their own judgments about what's in the best interests of their businesses. And I guess they demonstrate it in the range of projects that they have on foot around the world. I think it'd be unfair to say that other companies are not doing things in this area. I mean, in fairness, if you went to Chevron, for example, it's the lead developer and operator of the world's largest CCS project, the Gorgon project in in Australia, in Western Australia, in fact, which will store 3.5 to 4 million tonnes per annum from 2016. So, Shell is certainly active, but so too is Chevron, and a range of the rest of our members. Many of them perhaps aren't quite as open and publicly proclaiming what they're doing, but certainly we can see across the spectrum of the members in both oil, gas and coal that there's quite a deal of activity. The real issue is what increases that activity. And frankly, it goes back to, in our view, having the right policy measures in place that encourage further activity. We can see some of the experiences here. For very good reason, there's been very strong renewable energy policies globally over the last 10 years. And that's resulted in about $2 trillion worth of investment in new renewable capacity. At that same time, where there hasn't been anything like the same focus on CCS from a policy perspective, we've had $20 billion of investment. So you can see how good supportive policies actually bring on capital flows very quickly. And I think at the moment that's the thing that's missing.
What kind of costs are we talking around? I remember looking at the figures of the, I think it was the Sask Power one in Canada, and it was still quite a lot just for one unit of that power station. Are those costs, do you see those costs coming down in the next decade?
Sure. Well, the beauty of having that Sask Power plant now operating is we've got real data. And certainly the data coming from there and the statements from Sask Power go something like this. The first thing is, this is not a $1.3 billion carbon capture and storage project. It's actually two projects. About half of the cost was the refurbishment of the power plant, which you would have done regardless. And the other half of the cost was the capture plant. So in fact, the capture and storage end of this was only about half of that 1.3 billion. So I think that's the first important point to make. The second thing is, having now built it, Sask Power is saying that they will proceed in the next 2 years. They expect to build the next two of these, and that they'll be at least 30% cheaper in a capital cost sense. So you can see the learning by doing is enormous on that plant alone, and there's a 30% reduction. They're also saying that now that they've been operating it for a month, the energy penalty from the compression and capture process is vastly less than they expected. In fact, they've got an extra 15 megawatts of electricity they're selling, rather than devoting it just to the capture and storage process. And they expect they can make a lot further improvements in that with the next 2 units. So in prospect is very good downward pressure on price as we get to actually deploy a lot of this technology. In terms of cost, it was interesting in a conversation last night that I certainly heard that it wouldn't take a carbon price of $50 to make these things economic. It's probably close to that, but it's probably fair to say that even at a first or second of a kind plant, in that particular circumstance, that situation, it's a carbon price of about $50, and we're yet to really make significant reductions in cost. So I think it's all looking pretty positive.
There was a story in Bloomberg I saw this morning saying that thousands of CCS plants would be needed over the next, I think it was the next 10, 20 years. What are your guys' projections of the numbers that you think would be needed in order to limit warming to safe levels?
Well, you sort of have to go off somebody else's projections in many senses, and we tend to use the IEA's projections around this. And so these are models. Models and reality are often different. But you know, if the IEA is right about the percentages that they see energy efficiency, renewables, CCS and nuclear playing, then, you know, in very rough figures, for the ease of the maths, it's about 15% would come from CCS to 2050. So, you know, we're talking the next 35 years. And if you do rough calculations of the abatement challenge that sits in there in that time, you're probably talking about 9 gigatons a year from CCS. And if a 1,000 megawatt plant or a gigawatt plant is putting out about 9 million tonnes a year, that's about 1,000 of those sorts of plants you're talking about. So it's a pretty big ask, and certainly the IEA has got numbers of that sort of order. The other important point is we always talk about power. There are alternatives in the power area, and I think we need to be cautious about overdoing it here. Of course, renewables will play an increasingly significant role, and we've got to make sure energy efficiency really works. That's talking about half the task, and it's actually probably the element that is least well developed at this point. But we do need to reflect on industrial processes like steel manufacture, cement manufacture, and the like, because without CCS, those processes aren't going to reduce their emissions. And there's a lot more of those sorts of plants than there are of power plants. So the exact number, who knows? But you know, it's going to run into the thousands in sort of 35 years' time. So there's a big ask here.
And just finally, in terms of where, you know, we're talking about thousands of plants, India and China are looking like the world's two biggest coal consumers. What are the real prospects for CCS to be deployed in those countries on scale? Because I guess India particularly may not have the technology at its disposal. So give us a sense about how that could actually happen in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, of course, pardon me, we're not necessarily saying all these things have to happen in exactly those countries all of the time, and CCS is one of those technologies that's a bit location specific. But if we were to look at China, we know that the geology of China is very favourable for very large-scale storage. We now know that China is number 2 in the world for large-scale projects, and I think, frankly, it's going to be a set of decisions that the administration in China will make about the extent to which they want and need to deploy CCS. From our perspective, they show all of the signs of being very supportive at this stage, very keen to develop it, and I'm sure they'll make rational decisions into the future. I think in the case of India, it's at a stage of economic development that's rather different to China's, and so I'm not sure that necessarily abating emissions from coal-fired plants is their number one issue right now, when they've got a whole lot of other very difficult issues to contend with just at the moment. Nonetheless, we're delighted that we work in India, and we're helping to get them to a place where if it's a genuine option for them in the future, they'll deploy it. So these things are going to happen at their own rates according to what the policy settings are, what the opportunities are for financing, whether it's through the GCF or other mechanisms through the UNFCCC processes, and indeed the multilateral banks. So there's no simple answer here, but I would have to say I'm quite optimistic about China's opportunities.
And just quickly, you mentioned the GCF. Do you think the GCF will allow funding for CCS under the way it's structured at the moment?
Well, we don't really see any reason for it not to support CCS, and I think after you see the IPCC synthesis report and realise that after close assessment, 11 different economic models concluded as a median point, it's about 140% more expensive to address 2 degrees C if you don't have CCS, and importantly, 7 of the 11 models actually said you can't achieve 2 degrees C without it. If we take CCS off the table as an option, we're actually really doing the climate a disservice. We're not at a point where we can do that. So we don't think the GCF stops us, and we will certainly be working pretty hard to make sure that it is an eligible technology in there.